Hello and welcome back to our final session for the day. We are very pleased to have with us in this final session Professor Michael Murphy from the University of Helsinki, who will share with us his talk on the household projections, methods and applications. Professor Murphy is Emeritus Professor of Demography at the London School of Economics and Political Science and visiting international professor at the University of Helsinki. He is a fellow of the British Academy, the United Kingdom's National Academy for the Humanities and the Social Sciences, and chairs the Sociology, Demography, and Social Statistics section. He has acted as an advisor to the UK and US governments and international organizations such as the EU, UN, and OECD. He has also chaired the Scientific Review Board of the Max Planck Institute for Demographic Research. His current research areas include population projections, demographic modeling of aging and mortality trends, social care and living arrangements, and the well-being of older people. Professor Murphy, the time is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to this really excellent conference. I'm very pleased to be here and to acknowledge the success that you have in organising it. I'm going to start off by saying, why are we interested in households? It's clearly important for many outcomes, and many decisions are made at the household rather than at the individual level. One of the main areas for household analysis is in areas like benefits, social security, poverty, which are intrinsically household rather than individual based. And one of the main uses of projections is for looking at exactly the rights and obligations of people in the benefit system. As pointed out, households rather than individuals are often the main consumer units. An individual doesn't buy a new fridge. It's the household is the user of that and makes the decision about it. Housing demand is something that's been mentioned before, a key aspect. And housing demand is measured really by looking at the relationship between numbers of dwellings and numbers of households. And a shortage is when there are more households than dwellings, and a surplus is the reverse. Support may require actually co-residence, i.e. being in the same household, especially for older people. Many forms of care can be provided from outside, but if someone needs help, for example, during the night, then someone has actually got to be physically present in the household to do that. As also pointed out in other contexts, there are major environmental issues linked to households. At the global level, things like consumption of water, electricity, etc., depend more on the number of households than on the number of individuals. And of course, in households at the centre of political choices, in the UK, we have something called a bedroom tax. But people in households in the public rented sector, social housing as it's called, who are deemed to have more bedrooms than they need for the household size, have to pay an additional money to reflect that. So, and that's a very politically controversial issue. So households are at the centre of decision making for both individuals, for society, and indeed globally. We must make a distinction between the past and the future. Forecasts are need to know. They're the basis for making decisions, whereas the past is what we might call nice to know. It's interesting to see what's happened to households in the past, but the real question is, can we actually make some judgments about the future and act at the moment? John Haynel, who was one of the people who started off what we might call the modern approach to population projections, i.e. the cohort component method, in 1955 wrote in the Journal of the American Statistical Association about the the basic human need to make forecasts, even though, as he pointed out, it was actually a criminal offence in Roman times to do this, but it didn't stop people making these forecasts. If we look back at what's happened, I'll start off by summarising some of the developments in household projection methods and using the example of the UK official housing projections, which have been published for many decades now, well over 50 years. So they're very, very long standing and very much linked into the decision making. And I'll then look at a slightly different issue, an application of household projections, which is the case of population well-being, something which hasn't been looked at so far in this meeting, which so I've had some tried to identify something which might be a bit new right at the end of the session. Right. Well, household projections started in the 1930s in the US, based on the so-called headship rate method, which I think people are familiar with this now, even if they weren't perhaps as familiar with it at the beginning of the workshop. It's based on the so-called looking at what proportion of the population in different age groups are defined to be the household head. This method was developed by the National Resources Planning Committee in the US, which is perhaps slightly unfortunate because around the same time, the standard demographic projection, population projection methods were being developed. But these two seem to sort of start more or less at the same time from different bases, and they therefore tended to remain rather separate. And one of the benefits of the approach on pro-family is that it does actually bring them together in a much more coherent way than has been the case up until now. But to return to the early years, the United Nations produced a report on projections, household projections, and they said that the concept of the headship rate is the key to what they call modern methods, although this was 50 years ago, so they might not be still using that phrase to explain what is the current modern methods. And what happened is just extrapolation of past trends. That is usually done by some rather straightforward method using something like a mathematical curve, growth curve, and that's what's used in the UK, based mainly on the last 4 censuses. The British official projections using this traditional headship rate method, although we've now tended to replace the phrase headship by household representative membership. And there are 5 groups identified and information published about them. There are solos, people living alone, with 1 dependent, 2 dependent, or 3 or more dependent children, and everyone else. Our main interest is in older people. So in practice, very few of those people actually have dependent children in the household. So in practice, all we know about older people's household situation is whether they're living alone or not living alone, which is very limited for policy purposes to only distinguish people living alone or not living alone. And of course, the headship rate method gives you no information apart from the age and sex of the household head or household representative member. And it gives you nothing about what actually drives these changes in living arrangements, apart from the overall projected age and sex structure, which is taken from the official population projections. So it's very limited in what's available. And what's perhaps slightly strange is that the detail that is published has actually been reduced substantially in recent years. In the past, they used to have much more detail about the characteristics of the households, but now it's very limited. It's down simply to these simple binary measure between living alone or not living alone. There are many escalation issues in population projections. A general problem in all contexts is the treatment of the institutional population. That's problematic because we have very poor information about institutional populations. Surveys which are used to underpin much of the analysis are not normally conducted in those settings. The information that we do get is from areas like censuses, and those are actually quite poor in these settings where many of those older residents will be there for example, because of disability, particularly mental health problems, including things like Alzheimer's disease and other dementias. Their information is recorded by people by officials in the institutions, and they may not be fully aware of the details, and therefore the accuracy of information about the institutional population tends to be of lower quality and only available every 10 years. In the UK at the moment, that means that we are using information from 2011 as the latest data available, since the 2021 census results are not yet available. So it's quite a long time to wait and to use the best data available. The projected method is a black box. In that black box, there are projections made of things like marital status and cohabitation status, but they don't appear in the final projections. Strangely enough, the last published marital status projections for Britain were in 2008, 15 years ago, nearly. There are various reasons for this. One is that marital status is regarded now as being less important than it was in the past, particularly because of the cohabitation makes the interpretation of those data more problematic. There are problems even with measuring marital status, perhaps surprisingly. For example, large fractions of people now marry abroad. They go to the Maldives for their wedding, they come back, and that marriage is not recorded in the national statistics, and so you don't even know how many people are actually married in detail anymore. The projection of these household representative rates, extrapolation by gender, age, marital status, cohabitation, etc., is required about 240 separate projections to be made by mathematical curve fitting. And of course, that's something which people making standard population projections are well aware of when they've been doing the same for mortality projections in the past. You have this problem about consistency and coherence, whether the values you have for one age group are similar to those for neighboring age groups. So you get these, in mortality, you get these sort of crossovers where mortality of some groups, which we expect to be higher than the other groups, cross over at some stage if you extrapolate the curves independently. So there are, major problems with that, and how you deal with that is something that does, it's a problem with these methods. Another problem with it. I mean, this is an example of the difficulties in making a simple trend extrapolation. I mean, the logistic model was used before we started making cohort component projections for forecasting population numbers. These are two studies taken in the 1920s, 1930s in the US and in Britain, using the so-called logistic curve. And you see in the US, the model by Pearl fitted incredibly well when it was until it's fitted, but when it was projected, it very quickly failed to meet the growth rate that was observed in the US in the period. On the other hand, when a similar approach was taken for Britain and that curve was extrapolated into the future, it actually was well above the value that was observed, for example, in 2001. So even though we have models that may fit very well within the period of where we got data, the future may not be good in the future. So they're limited, and they're taking a risk. And the further we move into the future, the greater the risk in using these sorts of methods. There are other criticisms of the head-ship rate method. It's whether the term head of household is appropriate anyway in contemporary societies is a debate. many people say it's a more egalitarian society now, where the one individual is not somehow the head of and dominates all the other members of the household. But it also, as Keynote pointed out, that it doesn't actually give you any information about the processes which drive household change. There are all these. It's a dynamic process, but in formally we would call the headship rate method a static model, which applies some splitting fraction of the population into two groups: heads of household, not head of household, and we take it from there. So it gives you little information about the process as well. And of course, in order to overcome some of these limitations, there have been more formal cohort-based models. LeapPro model, which Franz Willikens referred to yesterday, developed at NIDI, and in particular ProFamily, which has been covered in this workshop, use transition rates of the formal determinants of household formation and dissolution: fertility, mortality, migration, partnership formation and dissolution, home leaving, etc. So it provides a realistic mathematical model of the processes involved. And as we think we know, something about what drives these processes, we can actually use our knowledge of how these things develop in order to make our better household projections. And as a byproduct of that, of course, we get information about the relative importance of these various determinants. Is migration more important for household formation than, for example, fertility or mortality changes? And we also get flexible and detailed information about the size and structure of households, rather than, as in the case of headship rate methods, information only about the limited information about the head of household. So, we get these projections which are now internally consistent, for example, the number of males who marry equals the number of females who marry, etc. It's also an enhanced version of the standard population projection method for national population projections, and therefore it's compatible and consistent with those. It uses the same components, fertility, mortality, and migration, but adds a lot more variables as well. It's well suited for official uses, such as planning and service delivery. But of course, data requirements are substantial compared to the headship rate method, and they may not be difficult. It may be difficult to, for example, make cross-national comparisons unless you have similar data in all the units. So I'm going to discuss a simpler approach to see if we can actually extract some useful information from household projections which would not have been available in other contexts. So what I'm going to do is to talk about the case of well-being. Why well-being? Well, I mean, people have recognized the limitations of things like gross national income per head as a measure of success of societies. And as a result of that, there has been pressure for alternative indicators of success to be measured. And in the UK, 4 national indicators are monitored and collected across all the major government surveys. These questions are included in all the major government surveys: the fortitude, happiness, satisfaction with life, and feeling that their life is worthwhile. And happiness in particular is a widely used indicator, and it's available not only in one country, but it's available globally as well. And so you can make comparisons across countries. So what I'm going to do is to identify the relationship between happiness and household and structure of older people in Europe in the 21st century, and then decompose the contribution of changing household and population structures to the overall level of happiness. I'm not going to sorry, I got the message about being muted. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you fine.
Okay, thanks. Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Sorry. Okay. I'm not going to talk about changing levels of happiness, but only of the effect of the changing household structure and population structures. So the question is, are the sort of changes we might expect in households likely to increase or decrease the overall level of happiness? And for that, of course, we need household projections to answer that question. The data I'm using is the European Social Survey, which has covered households in almost all of Europe. 9 countries have information on all rounds of the 9 rounds of the survey, and I'm going to include them in my analysis. And they all the rounds include well-being indicators, including, say, happiness and life satisfaction, 2 of the UK indicators. To make things simple, I'm only going to look at 3 fold coding of households. For those who are partnered, living alone, and others. These are mainly widowed people living with their children, but it includes all other groups as well. And confine it to the older population, those aged 65 and over, which gives a sample size of about 95,000 people. This shows the countries that are involved in here. This shows the proportion deemed as happy in the survey. Happiness is measured on an 11-point scale, and we define those as happy as being in the 2 top categories of that scale. So in sort of Nordic countries and British Isles, about 40% of people estimated at age 75 would be happy. In the sort of other Western European countries, Germany, Netherlands, etc., about 30%, and at the bottom, France is an outlier, but anyway, the countries of Eastern Europe tend to have much lower levels of happiness. So that's a distribution of the sample. And this shows the household structure of our sample population from age 65 up to age 90. 90 and over is an open-ended band by their household status, living alone. Roughly similar numbers across all age groups, but the partnered obviously declined substantially, and the other group is relatively constant across age groups. And if we look at that in terms of percentages, we see the decline in those partnered and the increase in those living alone as age increases. We've got our data here. The overall proportion reported as happy was about 28% of the sample. And so what I did was to fit a multinomial model to the data and extrapolate that model into the future to get the expected household distribution up to 2036. And this is the sort of information that we get. This is the data I've shown before, the distribution, for example, by age. And this shows the fitted values, the smooth fitted values to remove standing fluctuations. This is actually for 2018. And we now look at what happens to these trends over time. So this is, we just select one age, say age 75, and we find that over time from just over to 2000 to 2036, that we expect that the proportion of the population that are partnered to actually increase somewhat, the proportion living alone to decrease, and the other group to decrease slightly as well. The increase in the proportion partnered is due to improvements in mortality, and in particular to reductions in the sex differential in mortality. So the number of older female widows is likely to be less for that reason. We assume happiness is constant since there's no clear trend identified in this. This is the World Happiness Report, and this is quite difficult to read, I'm afraid, but this is actually Europe in the top here among older. This is Western Europe, is this blue line, and we can see that this is essentially constant over the last 20 years or so. So we think we're happy if we assume that these values constant and see how much change there is due to this changing household structures that we projected into the future. Again, we fit a statistical model for this using what's called a generalized additive logistic regression model, which is a form of regression which uses a non-parametric curve, so we have the maximum flexibility in our model. I'll give more details later if people want to ask about that. So, so this is what happens if we fit this model. This is the proportion estimated to be happy by age and household type of by age. And I mean, what is noteworthy about this, I think, is if we look at the black line, this shows the overall value by age, and we see that that this declines with age. There are people less happy at older ages, at age 90 than at age 65. However, if you look at within each individual household type, we find a rather different pattern. Firstly, those who are partnered actually are essentially constant. They have higher values than other people, but that remains relatively constant. The other two groups, those living alone and partnered, actually show an improvement in happiness over time from age 65 up to age 90. So we get this find that the overall value declines, but each of the components either remains constant or increases. So how can we get the overall value declining but the components increasing? Well, the reason is that the distribution of the population is changing over time. The proportion not partnered increases with age. Therefore, this is a weighted average of the three groups, but the weights change, and the older the age, the more weight these groups have in the calculation. So we're seeing already that the change in household structure can actually produce perhaps some unexpected results in fertility. So why might this be? Well, firstly, there is a tendency for happiness to reach a minimum in people among later working ages. This is a U-shaped distribution for happiness, and that tends to improve among older people, but then tail off at older ages. So it may be partly this so-called U-shaped distribution, but there's also selection as well, in that particularly why do these groups appear to improve their happiness so much with age? Well, partly because they're not the same people. The older groups are selected for survival. Indeed, the fact they're happy may be part of the reason they are still alive. We know that people are happy tend to live longer than people are not happy. So they are not the same people who are in this age group at 65 at age 90. So we can talk about the sort of complications of that, but the results that we have this difference between the overall average and the components is I think is what I'm going to concentrate on in this presentation. Right. So in order to show the effect of household structure, we can set up two models and fit them and see what they produce. The first model assumes that age-specific happiness rates are constant over the period 2002 to 2036, and that changes in the overall proportion who are happy depend only on population aging, which changes the population distribution to an older average age. The second model is we assume that age rates are constant, but also living arrangement rates are constant as well. So And again, we therefore see that the changes in the overall proportion, which is a weighted average of all the components, depends both on population aging and on changes in people's housing context. In order to get the population distribution into the future, I've used the UN's WPP, World Population Projections 2019 values for the population of Western Europe, because our data refer mainly to Western Europe. And so we just apply these values, the age-specific values, to that population structure as it evolves. And then we apply the second value by estimating how many of the people would be living in each of these different household types through as the period 2002 to 2036 to see what happens to happiness. When we do that, what we find is that in the model 1, this is when the age-specific rates remain constant, we would actually get a slight decline in happiness over time because of population aging and a slight tendency for population happiness to decline with age, but a very small effect. However, if we allow for this change in the household structure, which we expect to see in Well, there would actually be quite a substantial improvement in population level happiness because of the changing household structure. The reason for this is, as pointed out before, what we expect to see is an increase in the proportion of people who are partnered over time. And as they have high levels of happiness, this weighted average of the groups means that the overall population happiness would actually tend to increase over the period. So that's just an example of the sort of things that we can use as a very simple projection model, and applying and bring it together with what we know about some of these trends to find something which was not obvious before, that we might expect the average level of happiness among older people to actually increase rather than decline, as might have been expected if we simply failed to look at changing household structures. So this, as an application of household structure, we can obviously use alternative types of target variables. These could include sort of physical out measures such as CO2 emissions, water use, etc., electricity use. Those sorts of things which have been applied before. We can apply them to other social indicators apart from well-being, including sort of measures like poverty, and for policy purposes, to see how much formal and informal care is needed, because care is substitutable in some cases between formal and informal channels. Crucially, people who are partnered will tend to have access to informal care from their partner in a way that is not an option for those who are living alone. So the balance between formal and informal care depends substantially on household context. These target variables depend not only on things like household structure. Clearly, one's obviously got to be careful about over emphasizing as the only factor, and the possibility that some of these effects may vary across household types and within household types should be recognized. And possibly there would be a need to use a more elaborate modeling framework, something like structured equation modeling, which would allow those pathways to be investigated in more detail. But living arrangements does remain central to what may happen in these areas. We can also use additional housing variables. At the moment, it's been a very simple model using those three groups, but those could be, given in much more detail. In some cases, more policy-related breakdowns. Things like lone parent families are of considerable interest. Housing tenure is a major area of concern and policy study as well. Finish off by saying one sort of issue that might be worth talking about is, in much of social science, demography, people have a strong interest in what they call causal analysis, trying to identify, what is living beyond the simple associations we see between variables, and trying to make some judgment about what would happen in a causal sense. What are they? Are they just associations, or are they factors which actually drive the process? For population projections, that's often not a major interest. What we want in projections is accuracy. We want to be able to give our users information which they can take away and apply, and ideally we should also be able to give them indicators of the accuracy of our forecasts, so that they can plan not only for a single point outcome, but also be able to plan for the plausible range of variation they might expect to see in the future. So those are sort of issues which we know could be developed further. I'm realizing that this is approaching the dreaded 40-minute level, so I'll just finish up by giving some other quick analyses of work that has been undertaken as part of the project which Emily Grundy did talk about yesterday. One is to emphasize the importance of cohort factors. The sort of headship rate method it's inherently a period measure. It doesn't look at cohorts. This is some data using what's called the annual population study in the US and in the UK. It's based over a sort of a 20-year period. We've 2004 to 2020. It's got a total of 1.14 million respondents in it, so it's quite a big survey. And this just shows, first of all, the proportion of owner-occupiers in the UK by age and period over this period. I've extrapolated these values into the future from 2020 up to 2030. And we did say yesterday about the change in housing type over the past. And what we see here is, in shadow is the future, this is the past. And these diagonal lines show cohorts. So this red line here is the 1945 cohort. And what one can see here is a very strong cohort effect for home ownership in the UK, that this group born around 1945 have much higher rates of home ownership than those either born before or born after that period. And that's what that does emphasize, is the need for thinking of these processes as cohorts rather than period phenomenon. And that's why something like a method like ProFamily, which is intrinsically cohort based, is important, and one sees that. Finally, my last comment is on this is breaking down disability status by housing tenure, again for cohorts and for periods between 2004 and 2030, again with the past and the future. What I think is noteworthy here is that if one looks at the social rented sector, which was mentioned yesterday, incredibly high rates of disability among people in that sector. At these sort of ages, about between 50 and 60, over 60% of people in that sector are disabled as defined by government policy. The proportion in the own or occupied sector is about 25%. In the privately rented sector, about 35%. So again, this does emphasize and the implications that are substantial. One might think of what may happen to this group as they age, as these cohorts move up. So there is a considerable scope for looking at not only household structure in general, but the detail as well of housing tenure. And so I'll leave it there. And thank you for your attention, and ask any comments or questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Murphy, for the insights. That was a very impactful last slide that you have there. And we wish we could have hear more about that, but time is up. Here we have opened the floor for some questions, and there are 2 questions I see in the chat room. So perhaps I can read them out to you. The first question is from, I can't see who is it. I think it's from Vincent. Firstly, it's great that partnerships are increasing happiness, but I wonder if we can assume that partnership rates will increase into the future. Professor Murphy, your thoughts on that?
Partnership rates have been, they peaked for those born around 1945, ironically, not causally, by the fact that this was also the group with the highest rates of home ownership. The 2 things have been responsible for the reduction in partnership. One is the switch from a delay in marriage. That's been partially replaced by increases in cohabitation, but that hasn't been sufficient to make up the substantial increase in age of marriage. It's now over 30 in European societies. So there's been a decline at the bottom end. I mean, there's fewer people entering and all the way up. But on top of that, there's been an increase in partnership breakdown, in divorce as well. So those 2 factors brought together, and the fact that cohabitation partnerships tend to be more fragile than marriages, means that over time we will expect that that increase in partnership, which we're observing at the moment and is going to go through the 2020s, is not going to continue into the future, I'm afraid. And so from that point of view, it does look, from the point of view of given the sort of clear association there is between partnership and happiness, one would expect that in itself in time to reverse because of the way that partnership is developing. And this means we have a cohort perspective on this as to identify those sorts of trends.
All right, thank you. So let's move on to the second question, which is from Kyushi. Could you please explain a bit more about how migration could be accounted for in your household projections for UK?
Right. Well, as in most European countries, the main driver of population change is migration. Natural increase is close to 0 in Europe. It's perhaps interesting to note that in the UK, we've had below replacement level fertility now for 50 years. And yet we've only 1 year so far has ever been more deaths than births, in that 50-year period. So it's driven substantially by migration. It's of course it's not just migration as such. It's the implications of migration for the population structure as well. At the moment in the UK, something like 30% of births are to have one or both parents are immigrants, and about 25% of births, both parents are immigrants. So people talk about fertility among migrants being sort of slightly higher or slightly lower than the the general population. I mean, usually it's assumed to be slightly higher, but it's not true in all groups. For example, the Chinese group in Britain has actually lower fertility than the sort of the average. What it does is it makes a huge contribution to the annual number of births, simply because there are even if they don't have any higher fertility, that they generate a lot of births from that point of view. So they have a very major role in terms of household change. So yes, I mean, and that, as I say, it's not only them; it's the fact that their children and their grandchildren, etc., also add to that. I mean, I can say more about the structures are very different. The household structures, particularly among South Asian groups, tend to be much larger, and we have observed. I mean, what was a sort of a break? I think Emily Grundy did talk about that yesterday. This long-term trend of smaller household size has been stalled now, and household size has remained pretty constant, for a couple of decades. I mean, part of that is this thing, for example, young people remaining in at the parental home longer, so keeping that household size higher. But also, I mean, migration also has some role in that increase in household size as well. I mean, migrants often have poorer housing conditions. They often are the more crowded accommodation as well. So that has some role as well in terms of it. But it's not a major role, but it's certainly there as a factor. Right. That needs to be. We haven't said much about that simply because the number of older migrants, I mean, talk about the 65 plus, is at the moment not huge, and the number of second generation migrants is even smaller. Right. But I mean, it's something that will, in time, will have to be, taken into account much more carefully and thoroughly than it is at the moment.
Thank you for those insights. That's really useful. We can move on to maybe two more questions. I see many questions actually popping up. So let's move to another question from Professor Hayashi, which noted that some parts of the presentation were quite surprising. And the question is that the preference of living arrangement could change in time due to social norms and other factors. So how was this incorporated in some of your projections and computations? Preferences for living arrangements.
Yeah. That's true. I mean, what the relationship between sort of well-being and partnership is not new. I think William Forr in 1850 produced a paper which had the quote, "Marriage is a healthier state," when he looked at mortality by marital status in France in the 1850s, and that result has been replicated, many times. So yes, I mean, it's but in the past, people who have been partnered have tended to be more advantaged. I mean, historically, I mean, the people would normally have to have a sole reasonably secure economic base to marry, etc. That has changed. I mean, we've seen quite a substantial change now in the relativities. If you look at someone like people in their 40s now, those people who are living alone now are actually not disadvantaged socially and economically compared to those who are married or partnered. Now there has been clearly a shift, a preference for more individual living than was the case in the past. So it may well be that differential would be expected to reduce, simply because now you might, I mean, in the past, there's sometimes been a lot of people who are living not partnered and living alone. It's because they were not able to. Increasing now, people are doing it because it's their preferred, way of organising their lives. So yes, that would be expected to change, and one would need to incorporate that in the models, as well to recognise that, for example, by looking at socioeconomic factors as well in the models.
Thank you. Maybe a last question, given the time there. from someone named Richard. In one of your slides, you had said whether to prioritize causal analysis or improve accuracy in some of this work. And the question here is that, what is your personal opinion on the direction to then improve the estimation accuracy in terms of methods?
I raise that point because I think there is a increasing assumption that causal analysis is that the thing which we all want to try to achieve. I mean, there's been people would be quite often saying dismissive, say this is purely descriptive, or this is this does not give us any insight into process. I think for forecasting, what we need is robust, clear associations that help us to make good forecasts. Causal analysis is often, if something happened that we don't observe, what would the outcome be? In forecasting, what you want is the outcome which we do expect to observe. What will the outcome be? And I think that, so I think there is a sort of rather different focus and priority in terms of forecasting from this. I mean, I had that slide, Alicia, about the past is nice to know, the future is need to know. It's nice to know and examine what might have been responsible for what happened in the past. That does not necessarily give us a great insight into what will happen in the future. I mean, for example, for forecasting, what we really need is variables which can be used to give insight into the future. And the one example there would be the own occupation, that cohort effect. Now, that's a very robust finding. We expect to see those cohort patterns to continue into the future. So that's a very good basis for making forecasts about housing tenure for that reason. We don't say why people in 1940s, born in 1940s, had higher rates of home ownership. We don't explain why it happens, but it's a very good method for predicting what's going to happen in future. And so that's really is the difference in what one prioritizes in terms of one's work. In this case, would be to prioritize the accuracy. If people need those data for policy purposes, say this, we can feel reasonably secure that this is a good forecast. We're not saying there's anything causal. There was something that happened when people were born in the 1940s that meant they ended up, with higher rates of home ownership. But nevertheless, it's something that you will need to take. So that really is quite of the user needs. I think rather than somehow saying causality is the only thing we ought to prioritize in our work. I think we need to look at the user needs as well as our sort of preferences about methods of analysis.
Right. Yeah. Thank you very much. I'll just ask Kyushu if we have time for the two other questions. From
Please
Prof.
go ahead. Very shortly.
And Prof.
Yeah.
Jin Yong. Okay.
Yeah, please.
Prof. Jalal, would you like to unmute and join in the discussion, maybe ask the question, and Prof. Jean as well after that. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. Thank you, Mike, for the nice and very insightful presentation. My question is related to the project that we were supposed to do in the past, and is whether this methodology can be applied in any way to forecast genes, trends, and patterns using relative versus non-relative marriage in areas where consanguineous marriage is common. So it goes what we call to the direction of genetics and also demography.
Right. That's an interesting question. Thanks very much for that. Consanguinity is a very specific example, because one actually obviously needs to know about the sort of kinship network. I think this, in a way, links probably much more into what Franz Willikens was talking about when he did, he said we've got to start thinking about households as networks, and I think that is, absolutely the right way to think about housework. And of course, in terms of consanguinity, that you can obviously overlay that with the genetic relationships between the partners. that really is data. I think that is something which therefore needs really quite specific, well-constructed data sets in order to look at that sort of issue. And the sort of methods so far are tending to be rather straightforward. The sort of things I'm talking about can be undertaken with a simple single round surveys, perhaps repeated for so you've got some sort of trend data, but they're not sort of detailed sort of longitudinal data which one will be able to look at the outcomes in relation to because if we're looking at the child outcomes in relation to the genetic similarity of kinship coefficients of the parents, that means following up those dyads, the couple, and then looking at the outcomes for their children. So I think that would be an example. You probably would still want to use the more intensive methods, which would actually explicitly incorporate the genetic approaches, the usual sorts of methods that would be used for variance decomposition for that sort of area. So but in terms of getting macro level trends in terms of, say, consanguinity marriages, that is clearly important there. And what's interesting in that, as is how one has actually seen some increase in consanguineous marriages in some parts of the world, I think including Iran possibly, that it seemed one sort of had an assumption that those would decline over time but actually the reverse, for various reasons, appears to have happened among some communities, that people become more likely to marry. And of course that is a macro level phenomenon, and that would certainly be it comes within this sort of framework as long as you had information about that, and you could then try and project that into the future. Of course, it's a crucially important, if you are thinking of something like a marriage, then that's a very good predictor of what's going to happen later in terms of the character of the children, because you can use the past to make to know exactly what sort of genetic makeup there will be of the children in the future. So that is that's already a forecasting model for that particular application. So in some ways, yes, but I think still one would need the full array of methods to look at these sorts of genetic factors as well.
Thank you. And here we have a final question from Prof. Jin Yong, and she asked about this finding which you have presented in your research, which is that happiness level is related to partnerships. And does it mean that the household type is driving happiness, or could it be that the case that other factors related to this partnership household is a determinant?
Well, household structure and marriage are almost completely correlated in this case. So it's almost a sort of choice of language, whether you say this is due to your living arrangements or whether you due to your marital status. But there is clearly some parts of that association are due to socioeconomic status. So there's no, the benefit here is that one can look back on these 170 years of analysis of marital status and say mortality, for example, studies, and both, if you like, large scale studies, also more small scale studies. And there is clearly an advantage selection effects for marriage. One can look at something like Japan, where the mortality disadvantage, Noreen Goldman pointed out, was increased when marriage rates increased. The idea would be that the people who weren't able to marry, there's some fraction of them in the society, and when marriage is very high, the people who don't marry have particularly bad characteristics in terms of well-being. And so one can use this sort of information to, I'd say that there is some of it is due to the personal characteristics, but there is also intrinsic benefits from partnership. I mean, we know that, I mean, people who are partnered are better off economically, because basically they, two can live as cheaply as one is perhaps not wholly true, but it's, they had better, they're able to have better standards of living, they have more companionship, they get better advice on their health, they have people to look after them, they have people to monitor their behavior. So there are, these are all benefits intrinsic to the state. They're not to do with the characteristics of the people. So they're both there, and so yes, we would expect them to retain some advantage, even though I suspect that would reduce, because, as pointed out before, things like people's lifestyle preferences for, say, living alone now appear to be increasing compared to the people's benefits from partnership. So yes, it's there, it will continue, but it may slightly diminish over time.
Thank you, indeed. So we have come to the end of this session. Please join me in thanking Professor Murphy for his wonderful lecture. May I now turn the time over to Kyusher for the closing remarks.
Thank you very much, Professor Murphy. Thank you, Joel. And on behalf of the conference committee, Professor Jin Yang, Professor Joel Fang, Professor Zheng Yi, and Professor Zhang Xuying, and also on behalf of the co-director of CIPR, Professor Busalava Tilavichchanan, and Professor Vincent Chua, I would like to show our great appreciation to UNPD, APA, CHADS from Peking University, CPDRC, and as well as PAS. We would like to thank all of our keynote speakers and our distinguished guests. We thank all of our panel speakers and our participants. And I think all of us, please join me to thank the conference secretaries, Ms. Lucy Yao, Ms. Zara Binti Muhammad, Ms. Said Rabia, and Ms. Chu Hui-Qing Amy. And we do hope this conference, could help you in the field of household protection. And then we sincerely hope in the near future, COVID will end and we could have a chance to meet in Singapore. Have a nice weekend. Bye-bye.